Always and everywhere, power attempts to centralize. In his book on power, the political theorist Bertrand de Juvenal explained that power is always seeking to erode barriers to the process of centralization. In its most organic construction, civilization is formed out of the overlapping spheres of social sovereignty. Man is, of course, a political animal, and none of us exist in complete isolation, but instead find ourselves bound into a web of social dependencies and obligations. The family, church, tribe, fraternity, and guild each make demands on us and provide for the needs of their members. This network of voluntary and involuntary associations grants us identity and meaning while also providing us with a community within which we can practice virtue. Our dependency and duty on these spheres sustains and defines us, but they also serve as a barrier to the centralization of power. Those with very specific familial, religious, and regional identities and obligations are far less likely to follow the dictates of centralized authority. I think all of us can recognize this when we think about the pandemic and how religious communities were often the ones that push back the hardest. Power must collapse these opposing spheres of power if it's to achieve its goal. Regional authorities, organic identities, and natural hierarchies are all barriers to the centralization of power. In the 1940s, James Burnham introduced the idea of the managerial revolution that had radically altered the modern state. So Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and liberal democracies like the United States may have significant differences, but ultimately each of these states was built on a managerial structure. After the Industrial Revolution, the paradigm of mass production and mass consumption required a shift in social organization. Large bureaucratic structures were required to meet the logistical, technical, and social challenges of mass society, and those organizations required a new class of experts to operate them. These mass bureaucratic structures promised a miraculous degree of material abundance by operating at scale. Logistical mastery would generate an enormous degree of wealth through efficiency. In order to reliably extract this degree of efficiency, the new class of experts would need to apply a standardized set of managerial techniques. Just as the uniformity of cogs in a machine are necessary for the operation of an assembly line, the mass managerial bureaucracy requires universalization to scale the massification of human organization. In his book Leviathan and Its Enemies, the paleoconservative theorist Samuel Francis continued James Burnham's critical work by outlining the process by which the managerial revolution dissolved the competing structures of bourgeois capitalism. While capital had already revolutionized many competing social spheres, managerialism required their complete abolition. Always and everywhere, power seeks to centralize, and managerialism draws its particular strength through centralization via mass bureaucratic social organization. The uniform application of managerial techniques is hindered by the cultural and moral particularity that competing spheres of social sovereignty generate. The individual worker who has a large family with many children may be unwilling to devote his entire life to the corporation. The devout Christian may oppose commerce on Sabbath or the practice of usury. The devout Muslim may require the observance of particular dietary restrictions. An individual whose family has lived in a region for generations may be unwilling to sacrifice the well-being of that particular community in the name of economic efficiency. Particular peoples with particular identities and ways of being are the enemies of universalized bureaucratic management. Francis also observed that the managerial elite attempt to break down these barriers to universal application by homogenizing culture. Hedonistic and cosmopolitan identities are highly malleable, so the managerial elite desire a deracinated population which can be more easily manipulated. By replacing dependency on morally and culturally particular structures like family and church with dependency on mass managerial structures like public education or the welfare state, the managerial class can gain power over the individual and separate them from other social spheres. This is why progressive secular humanism, or wokeness, if you prefer, is also an ally of the managerial revolution. Wokeness disincentivizes the creation of opposing social spheres of sovereignty by stigmatizing family formation and traditional religion while coding them as low status. Organic identities are replaced with more general and often commodifiable identities, which can be consumed and discarded. In the name of liberation, the individual is stripped of every duty and dependency, but is also made entirely dependent on the managerial regime. Without the natural protection of competing social spheres, the deracinated individual is left defenseless against the complex of state actors and corporations that now demand his total allegiance. In addition to outlining the cultural assimilation that managerialism would require, Sam Francis also predicted that the internal logic of managerialism would compel it to pursue globalization. Managerial structures produce their miracle of abundance through organization at scale, so the continuous expansion of their logistical network is always necessary. The boundaries of the nation are arbitrary barriers to the mass bureaucratic mindset, and once the managerial elite have completed their revolution inside the borders, they will naturally turn their gaze outward. New markets mean access to new consumers, new resources, and new laborers, but the revolution is never simply economic in nature. Managerial regimes find it easier to coordinate with other managerial regimes of the same order, which is why the United States and the wider West have been obsessed with the spread of liberal democracy. George W. Bush and other conservatives have often been mocked for the idea that at the heart of every nation lies a liberal democracy yearning to be free. Somewhere in Afghanistan, you just had George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton all just cowering in caves waiting for the United States to go ahead and unleash them on the rest of the world. But this is simply not an extension of the universalism, or rather, this is simply an extension of the universalism which the managerial revolution demands. Massified national organizations naturally seek to expand their power by becoming international organizations. The WHO, IMF, WEF, NATO, and several other international entities are all constantly seeking to add new nodes to the managerial network, creating a loose globalized managerial order without any formal name. These organizations always emphasize problems on an international scale. Global warming, pandemic response, and world overpopulation are all issues that are too large for any one nation to address on its own. By focusing on large and abstract issues, the managerial elite can locate their decision-making centers well outside of the nation itself. This makes it almost impossible for the citizens of that nation to hold any real power accountable, even as they continue to participate in the democratic process at home. For the ever-expanding network of managerial bureaucracy to spread profitably to new regions, it must successfully homogenize culture. It's not enough for the culture to be uniform inside the nation. It must also become uniform across the entire international network. This conversion of nations into liberal democracies assists in the process. Democratic elites must introduce mass media, bureaucratic organization, and therapeutic amelioration for them to go ahead and achieve the kind of social engineering that's required to maintain power under a system of popular sovereignty. New democratic leaders in foreign countries thus benefit greatly from connecting their subjects to the global network of managers already established by the West. Mass media begins its work, and then McDonald's, Starbucks, and Apple stores inevitably follow. The particulars and history of the nation are slowly worn away as a tide of foreign culture flows in. International organizations become major employers as well as cultural staples and grow in importance until they are so integral to the operation of the country that no one can imagine a world without them. Managers and personnel flow over borders as naturally as the goods that those organizations produce. The very idea that people differ in any significant way from those of another country slowly disappears. No group has claim to any given nation because all nations are now part of the mass managerial network. The managerial elite develop international class interests because their interdependent networks make the nation itself interchangeable units. Managing a government is seen as no different from running an international corporation or a non-government organization. All of these entities feature similar bureaucratic structures, and the managers have an easy time moving between them. Just as it sought to homogenize culture inside its original borders, the global managerial order must break down the particularities of the nations to which they want to expand. This is why wokeness has gone international, with movements like Black Lives Matter gaining traction in countries like England or Ireland, where no history of racialized conflict really exists. Starbucks is running ads about transgenderism in India right now for a reason. And it has everything to do with coffee consumption if you understand it correctly. Countries like the United States are using gay rights as the justification to go ahead and send tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine or Israel. Progressive secular humanism is the universal acid meant to dissolve all cultural particularities and turn the people of each nation into blank slates onto which managerial techniques can be freely pressed. The good news for those of us that acknowledge the nation as the form of social organization most conducive to human flourishing is that the current managerial order cannot stand. Humans are simply not fungible widgets who can be easily exchanged or replaced. We are not meant to be stripped of our heritage, traditions, religion, language, in a quest to simply assemble the bureaucratic Tower of Babel. Like the Soviet Union, or like Soviet communism, managerial liberalism has made faulty assumptions about human nature, which will doom its project. Like the late Soviet Union, late-stage liberal managerialism will eventually come apart. The only question will be, do the nations of the West have leaders ready to shepherd their people to a brighter future?